you would, turn with me to the book of Amos, chapter 2. And as you're turning there, let me remind you that we're in the second section of the book. We're almost ready to finish this section and move on to the third section, but we're still in the second section, which is the pronouncement of judgment upon 8 different nations. 6 of those nations are heathen nations, or what we would call Gentile nations. The other 2 are Judah and Israel. Now in chapter 2, verses 6 through 16, Amos pronounced judgment upon Israel, and it came as a complete shock to them. Now let me explain why. Up to this point, Amos had pronounced judgment on 7 different nations: Syria, Philistia, Phoenicia, Edom, Ammon, Moab, and Judah. Now to the Jewish people, 7 is the number of completion. So after Amos pronounced judgment upon Judah, the 7th nation, the Israelites just naturally assumed that the list was complete and that Amos would begin prophesying on a completely new and different topic. And his prophecy would be something good, because in the Jewish culture, the number 8 signifies a new beginning, which is a good thing and not a bad thing. Now, let me give you some examples to illustrate what I'm talking about. How many of you are familiar with Jewish numerology? You really need to be familiar with it, because if you don't understand the symbolism of certain numbers, you really miss what the Bible is saying. So let me kind of explain why the number 8 signifies a new beginning, and also that it's a good thing and not a bad thing. I'm going to give you some examples to illustrate what I'm talking about. The 8th day of the first week is the first day of a new week, and it's also the day that Jesus was resurrected. If you remember, Jesus was resurrected on the first day of the week, the 8th day. And with his resurrection, we have new life, which is good. Another example is Noah's Ark. There were 8 people on Noah's Ark. And those 8 people repopulated the earth, so it was a new beginning, and it was good. If you remember when Noah offered the sacrifice, it was a sweet-smelling aroma. God said, I'm never going to curse the world again, but this is a good thing. The Feast of Tabernacles lasts for 7 days. And the 8th day is a holy convocation. Now, the Feast of Tabernacles is the last of 7 feasts. If you remember the feast, they're the Feast of Passover, the Feast of Unleavened Bread, the Feast of First Fruits, the Feast of Pentecost, the Feast of Trumpets, the Feast of the Great Day of Atonement, and the Feast of Tabernacles. So it is the last of the 7 feasts. And the holy convocation on the 8th day symbolizes a new beginning. And ultimately, it symbolizes a new dispensation, because these feasts are prophetical. They're telling us what's going to happen in the future. The spring feasts were to tell us what was going to happen when the Messiah came the first time. The fall feasts are prophecies of what's going to happen when Jesus comes the second time. So when we talk about this 8th day, we're talking about a new beginning. This 8th day is a new beginning, but it also symbolizes a new dispensation. You see, one day in a cosmic week is 1,000 years. And let me explain what I mean by that. A regular week consists of 7 days. If I tell you I want you to come back here in a week, I'm telling you I want you to come back here the same day, or I want you to come back next Wednesday, but there's 7 days that will come. So a regular week consists of 7 days. But a cosmic week consists of 7,000-year days. Now, the concept of a cosmic week is based on Psalms chapter 90, verse number 4. And it's not going to come up on the screen because I didn't give it to them. But you can turn in your Bible to see what I'm talking about. Turn with me, if you would, in your Bible or on your phone or your iPad to Psalms chapter 90, verse number 4. Notice what it says. For 1,000 years in your sight are like a day that has just gone by, or like a watch in the night. So what this is saying is, to God, 1,000 years is like one day. In fact, Peter quotes this when he's talking to the people that say, just like you skeptics do, well, they've been saying that Jesus is going to come back forever, and he still hasn't come back. And he wants to talk about, you don't understand, God is very patient, and he's loving, and he wants to give everyone a chance to repent. But there will come a day that he doesn't. But he quotes Psalms chapter 90, verse number 4. And this is what he says in 2 Peter chapter 3, verse 8. Look that up in your Bible. If you don't have your Bible, write that down. 2 Peter chapter 3, verse 8. Go home and read it. Here's what it says. But beloved, be not ignorant of this one thing. One day is with the Lord as 1,000 years. And 1,000 years as one day. So the concept of a day being equivalent to 1,000 years from God's perception of time is based on Psalms chapter 90, verse number 4, and all of the prophets and the apostles pick up on that. Now, according to ancient Jewish eschatology, at the end of the sixth cosmic day, the millennium will begin. In other words, after 6,000 years, the millennium is going to start. And it will last for 1,000 years, which is the seventh cosmic day. And at the end of the millennium, eternity begins, which is the eighth cosmic day. And it never ends because it's something new. And it's better than good, it's perfect. In fact, let me kind of elaborate on this if you don't mind. How many of you know when was Adam and Eve created? Is there a specific date? Does anyone know? What do the Jews believe? Well, the Jews, looking at the genealogies from the Bible, in fact, we did this when we went through the book of Genesis. It actually tells us when Adam and Eve were created, tells you how long they lived. And so we can go and we can look at certain things and we can calculate back. The Jews believe that Adam and Eve were created in 4004 BC. How many of you knew that? You should know that because I've taught this before. All right? Now, in this period of time, there is something called a cosmic week. And the reason it's called a cosmic week is because the Greek word for world is cosmos. If you listen to the Russians, they refer to their astronauts as cosmonauts. Why did they refer to them as cosmonauts? Because they were going up to be able to see the world. Cosmos is the word for world. So the way God perceives time in the world is different than we do. According to Psalms chapter 9, verse number 4, to him a day is 1,000 years, and 1,000 years is a day for God. So when we look at this, we see that Adam and Eve were created in 4004 BC. Now, Jesus comes when? When was Jesus born? I taught on the Christmas star. How many of you remember? You came to that series, and we looked at when the Christmas star would have taken place. We looked at all the things about a cosmic week. When was he born? He would have been born on the Feast of Trumpets. I explained why. Not going to go into that. You can go back and look at that series. But September the 11th, 3 BC. Now here's what's interesting. At the end of 1,000 years, you would come to 4 BC, but he's born on September the 11th, which is going to start the Feast of Trumpets, that now is going to come in at 3 BC. He's going to begin a new cosmic day. So you've got 4,000 years until Jesus Christ comes, which is the equivalent to 4 cosmic days. Is everyone with me? Everyone following what I say? Okay, now from Jesus to when he was crucified, when was he crucified? Let's put a little cross here. And resurrected. You guys don't remember. I taught on this in Easter one time. I believe that he was crucified in 32 BC. Some say he was crucified in 30 BC. Others say 33 BC. But the reason I believe it's 32 BC is because he had to fulfill the Feast of Passover. And the Feast of Passover took place on a Thursday. Jesus gave us the sign of Jonah. He said, as Jonah was in the belly of the whale for 3 days and 3 nights, so shall the Son of Man be in the belly of the earth for 3 days and 3 nights. That means that Jesus had to be crucified on a Thursday. Why? Because if we count them off, we know that he was resurrected on the first day of the week, which would have been a Sunday. All right, everyone with me? Sabbath is Saturday for the Jews. That's the last day of the week. The first day of the next week is on a Sunday, but he was resurrected before the sun came out. So if we look at it, on a Thursday, he was crucified, and he died around 3 p.m. When the high priest said, it is finished, Jesus said, it is finished, and he gave up the ghost. So you still had a little bit of time there. So you got Thursday, Friday, Saturday, and before the sun came up, he was resurrected. And then if you look at 3 days and 3 nights, you have Thursday night, Friday night, Saturday night. And before the sun came up, Jesus was resurrected. So he had to be crucified on a Thursday. Passover took place in 32 BC on a Thursday. Everyone with me? Now this is what's interesting. From this point, 4,000, we are now at 2016. How many years from here, we think of this as 0, but he was born at 3 BC. We've got this period, 32 BC, so we've got this age. He's around 34 years old when he comes because we're not going to count 0. Everyone with me? But here we are at 2016. How many years have passed since Jesus was crucified? It's not rocket science, people, it's math. Approximately 2,000 years, right? So we've got 4 days, or what we would call 4 cosmic days. Because to God, we're looking at a cosmic week. A day is 1,000 years, and 1,000 years is a day. So we've got 4,000 years to Jesus Christ. And then we've got almost 2 cosmic days here. 2,000 years. Now, here's what's kind of interesting. Jesus starts from this 4,000 years here. He starts the next day, which is, let's put this as a day here, because we have 4 days and 1 day makes 5. 1 day right here makes 6, and we're going to be 6, and we're going to start something in just a minute, and I'm going to talk about that. But here's what's interesting. He starts the 5th cosmic day. What does the number 5 signify in Hebrew numerology, Jewish numerology? Anyone know? How many of you are carpenters? Anyone a carpenter? How many of you work with your hands around power tools? Hold up your hands. Do you have all 5 fingers? Do you have all 5 fingers by the grace of God? You see, if you work with your hands, you need to understand something. If you work with your hands around power tools, it's only by the grace of God that by the time you reach your old age and you retire, you have all of your fingers. That's a good way to remember that the number 5 symbolizes and signifies grace. Jesus Christ came and began the 5th cosmic day. He ushered in the dispensation of grace. Everyone with me? So now we're in this period of grace because of what Jesus did, but there's this period, when does he actually usher it in? He doesn't actually bring in this period of grace until he's crucified. So this cosmic period doesn't start until right here. We're here right now. Now, when we get to the 6th cosmic day, or to the end of the 6th cosmic day, that means we're at the end of 6,000 years. 4,000 years, 2,000 years, 6,000 years. But we're actually looking about this time somewhere in this area. Everyone with me? Everyone understand where I'm going with this? Because this is very important. Because you need to understand that once we get to the end of the 6th day, we start the sabbatical year of or the sabbatical day of the cosmic week. It's known as a period of rest. What does the Bible say that period of rest is? The millennium. Jesus returns, he sets up his kingdom on this earth, and he rules for 1,000 years. After he rules, and we're going to put millennium here, that's 1,000 years. That's why it's called the millennium. After that 1,000 years, you have what? The great white throne judgment, and then you have a new heaven and a new earth. And the new Jerusalem comes down. And that begins on the 8th day in a cosmic week. People, it is a new beginning. And it's not just good, it's perfect. Now, I've gotten off on this so that you can understand why the number 8 is so significant. The number 8 means it's a new beginning, it's good. The number 7 means it's complete. This is 6,000 years until we get to the millennium. Then there's another 1,000 years, which makes 7,000 years. If you look at it as cosmic days, it is 7 days. 7 is the number of completion. God's going to bring everything to completion. It's not in completion at the millennium. Why? Because Satan is only locked up for a time. For 1,000 years. But he's going to be let loose, and when he's let loose, you still have this final revolt against God. But after the end of that, it is complete. It's finished. It's done, and we start the new day. Everyone with me? All right. But my point is this, has nothing to do with this. We're changing. After Amos pronounced judgment on Judah, the seventh nation, the Israelites just naturally assumed that the list was complete. And then Amos would begin prophesying on a new and different topic. And it would be something good because they're all familiar with Jewish numerology. Because after all, every nation that Amos pronounced judgment on was an enemy of Israel, including Judah. So after Amos pronounced judgment on Judah, they expected to hear something good from Amos. And they were shocked because Amos began pronouncing judgment on them. So let's look at the judgment that he pronounced on them. And as we look at this, let me just make this little comment. It was very important that he do this because had he not done it this way, they would have been putting up walls of defense. Every time he was talking about them and the sin they'd done and the judgment that was coming, they were going, okay, he's going to get to us, he's going to get to us. And finally he gets to the seventh one, which is Judah, and they go, whoo, completion, finished. He's going to start a new subject and it's going to be good. So all of a sudden they let their defenses down. All right, let's hear it. And that's when Amos pops them. Look at Amos chapter 2. Let's read verses 6 through 16. Thus says the Lord. Notice that the word Lord is in all caps. What does that mean? It means that's Yahweh. That is the redeeming, covenant-keeping name of God. If you're not in a covenant relationship with Him, you can't use that name. He is not Yahweh to you. He is Elohim, one of the other names. If you're really lost as a goose, He's Allah, because Allah's the devil. Anyways, that's not even close. I shouldn't even say that. But anyways, thus says the Lord, for 3 transgression of Israel and for 4, I will not turn away its punishment, because they sell the righteous for silver and the poor for a pair of sandals. They trample on the heads of the poor as on the dust of the ground, and they deny justice to the oppressed. A man and his father go into the same girl to defile my holy name. And you guys know what that is. That's a euphemism to have sex with it. A father and a son go to the same girl. They lie down by every altar on clothes taken in pledge, and they drink wine, bought with unjust fines. Yet it was I who destroyed the Amorite before them, whose height was like the height of the cedars, and who was as strong as the oaks. Yet I destroyed his fruit above and his roots beneath. Also it was I who brought you up from the land of Egypt and led you 40 years through the wilderness to possess the land of the Amorite. I raised up some of your sons as prophets and some of your younger men as Nazirites. It is not so, O you children of Israel, says the Lord. But you gave the Nazirites wine to drink and commanded the prophets, saying, do not prophesy. Behold, I am weighed down by you as a cart full of sheaves is weighed down. Therefore flight shall perish from the swift. The strong shall not strengthen his power, nor shall the mighty deliver himself. He shall not stand who handles the bow. The swift of foot shall not escape. Nor shall he who rides a horse be able to deliver himself. The most courageous men of might shall flee naked in that day, says the Lord. Oh my gosh. All the other judgments on the other nations were 2, 3 sentences or verses at the max. He starts in verse 6 and he goes all the way to the end of chapter 2 to chapter 3. What is happening here? God is twice as tough on the nation of Israel as he was on the 7 other nations. And let me show you why I say that. Look at verse number 6. Thus says the Lord, for 3 transgressions of Israel and for 4, I will not turn away its punishment, because they sell the righteous for silver and the poor for a pair of sandals. Now I want you to notice that Amos begins this pronouncement of judgment with the common Hebraism. For 3 transgressions and for 4. And by now you should know what that means. What does that mean? Well, it means that they were guilty of multiple sins. And these sins had filled the cup of God's wrath up to the brim. But the 4th sin caused the cup of God's wrath to overflow. And now that it's overflowing, God's wrath cannot be stopped. Now, at this point, Amos deviates from the normal pattern. Instead of naming one sin, the 4th sin, the sin that caused the cup of God's wrath to overflow, he lists 7 sins. He doesn't list all the sins that caused it to get filled to the brim. He's now talking about this 4th sin because, oh no, there's not just 4 sins, there's 7 sins. In other words, wasn't just one major sin that caused the cup of God's wrath to overflow. There were 7 major sins. Now, what does the number 7 signify? It signifies completion or completeness. Now, whenever you complete something, you're finished. As an example, if you complete a project, then you're finished with it. If you're taking a test and you complete the test, you're finished. When I complete the book of Amos, we will be finished with it. Well, in this regard, God is saying, and Amos is saying, that their sin is complete and God is finished with them. It's over. And he doesn't say this to Judah. Judah gets carried away into captivity. Cyrus makes the command, they come back. Now, as I told you, the Assyrians were defeated by the Babylonians, so many of the northern tribes that were carried into captivity, they got to come back at that period too. But they never revived as a nation. They never did. They were finished. In fact, they don't actually come back until you get to the time of rest, the millennium. But you need to understand, he lists 7 sins, which means your sins are complete and God is finished with you. And we'll see exactly how that's carried out when we get to the end of this. So, what were the 7 sins that they were guilty of? Well, let me give them to you, and then we're going to go through each one of them individually. Don't worry about writing these down. I'm going to go through them very quickly, and then we're going to look at each one of them individually, and it will come up on the screen so you can write it down then. All right? So here are the 7 sins they were guilty of. Number 1, they were lending money to the poor with the sole intent of taking possession of their mortgaged property through foreclosure. Oh, yeah. The only reason they were lending money, the only reason they were helping the poor is because they had an ulterior motive. I'm going to lend them money knowing they can't pay it back so that I can foreclose on their property and it can be mine. I can seize it. Number 2, they were walking all over the poor through unscrupulous business practices. Number 3, they were preying on the vulnerable and taking advantage of them sexually. Number 4, when they foreclosed on the poor, they were taking every last thing that they had, including the clothes on their back. Number 5, they were abusing their power and authority by levying unjust fines in order to support their own selfish pleasures. Number 6, they were coercing the Nazarites into breaking their vows, and they were silencing God's prophets. And last but not least, they were ungrateful to God for the grace and mercy that he had showed towards them and their nation. Now, these sins might not seem as evil to you as those committed by the pagan nations, but I want you to assure you, in God's eyes, they are. In fact, they're not only just as evil in God's eyes, he considers them to be almost more evil. But we don't see it because we don't understand what theologians call ethical monotheism. How many of you know what ethical monotheism is? Well, this is a term you need to write down. We have lost this in the church today, and let me explain something. The reason I chose the book of Amos to go through it is because Amos, or I should say the nation of Israel that Amos is prophesying to, this nation of Israel is America today. This is America today, and we need to understand that. We're guilty of the very same things. And the early church knew something that the church today doesn't know. We think if we believe in Jesus Christ, but we treat other people any way that we want to, that we're going to make it to heaven. And let me tell you, the early church wasn't like that. Let me just explain something to you. Every one of the disciples, with the exception of John, was martyred. I should say apostles. We refer to that kind of synonymously, the 12 disciples of Jesus. But I'm talking about the apostles, those who walked with Jesus, those who lived with Jesus, those apostles. Every one of them were martyred with the exception of John. And the only reason John wasn't is because they tried to kill him. They tried to boil him in oil, and they couldn't understand it because the oil was boiling, and they put him in it. Christian tradition tells us, and it couldn't kill him. So they exiled him to the Isle of Patmos because God wasn't finished with him. He wrote the book of Revelation. But you need to understand that persecution began somewhere around early 60s. Peter and Paul were both martyred. Both martyred in Rome. And let me tell you what it did to the early church. In the early church, if you wanted to become a Christian, you had to go through a 3-year process before you were baptized. And you didn't get to partake of the church's blessings. You didn't get to partake of the communion until you were baptized. But the reason it was a 3-year process is because they understood that if you become a Christian, you're going to be persecuted. And if you're going to be persecuted, you have to be able to stand. And if you can't stand, you're going to make the whole church look bad. And so they literally would look at your life, and if you were involved in something that was bad, if you were involved in some type of business that was against Christian principles, you weren't allowed to be baptized, and you didn't become part of the church. And we've lost that today. I don't make any apologies for it, because the truth of the matter is we want people to accept Jesus and come in, but in a sense we have so watered it down that you raise your hand to receive Jesus and then you go live your life any way that you want to. Well, they had a term called ethical monotheism, and we still have it today, and it's what the Bible teaches. So if you don't know what ethical monotheism is, write down this definition. Here's what it is. Ethical monotheism is the worship of the one true God, monotheism. Monotheistic, we believe in one God. Ethical monotheism is the worship of the one true God by practicing and adhering to the values and morals that He's revealed to us. In other words, it's the belief that I can't truly worship God or truly love God if I don't live by and practice the values and moral principles that He's revealed to us through the Bible. People, that's what ethical monotheism is. If I say that I love God, but I don't treat others the way that God tells me to treat them, then I'm lying. I don't really love God. Because if I really loved God, I would keep His commandments. I would adhere to His principles. Now wait a minute. That's what Jesus said. Look at John chapter 14, verse 15. Jesus said, if you love me, you will keep my commandments. Yeah, He's talking about ethical monotheism. So to love God, I've got to love others, and I've got to treat them the way that God says I should treat them. And if I don't, then I really don't love God. And you can't help but, as you read through the Bible, to see this over and over again. Not only in the New Testament, but it's really emphasized in the New Testament. In fact, notice what John says in 1 John chapter 4, verse 20 and 21. He says, if someone says, I love God, but he hates a Christian brother or sister, that person is a liar. Pretty strong words. You guys think I'm snarky? He's calling you a liar. For if we don't love people we can see, how can we love God whom we cannot see? And He has given us this command, not suggestion. Those who love God must also love their Christian brothers and sisters. So according to God's word, to truly love Him and to worship Him is to love others and to treat others the way God says we should. And from the very beginning, God has emphasized this. Not just in the New Testament. Jesus didn't come and teach something new. In fact, look back at the 10 Commandments. Notice what the 10 Commandments say. The first 4 commandments have to do with our relationship with God. I'm God alone. Thou shalt have no other gods before me. Number 2, thou shalt not make any graven image. In other words, idols. Number 3, thou shalt not take the name of God in vain. Number 4, thou shalt remember the Sabbath and keep it holy. So all 4 of those commands in the 10 Commandments deal with my relationship with God. But let's keep going, because the last 6 commandments have to do with my relationship with others. Number 5, honor your father and mother. Number 6, thou shalt not kill. Number 7, thou shalt not commit adultery. Thou shalt not steal. Thou shalt not bear false witness. And last but not least, thou shalt not covet. So in order to have a right relationship with God, I have to have a right relationship with others. And if I don't have a right relationship with others, then I don't truly love God and I don't truly worship Him in spirit and in truth. And that's why Jesus will say to many of us, depart from me, I never knew you. This is this principle called ethical monotheism. And Jesus comes along and He emphasizes this. A lawyer came to Him and said, Jesus, what's the greatest commandment? And He didn't bat an eye. He didn't blink. He didn't have to think about it. He told him exactly what it was. Turn to Matthew chapter 22, verses 36 through 39. Notice what it says. Master, which is the great commandment in the law? In fact, I don't like the way that that's translated, because actually in the Greek it says, what is the greatest? What's the number one commandment? Out of the 613 commandments in the Torah, which one is the greatest? What's the most important? Jesus said unto him, Thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, and with all thy soul, with all thy mind. This is the first, and it doesn't mean it's the first commandment. There's the 10 commandments. We can look, I'm God. What it means is, by first is top priority. This is number one. And it's the greatest commandment. Then he goes further. And the second is like unto it. Thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. Now, do you see that? The second greatest commandment is just as important as the first greatest commandment. That's what Jesus meant by the statement, the second is like unto the first. He meant it's just as important. Now, listen to me, because this is very important. You cannot truly love God and truly worship God if you don't treat others the way you're supposed to. And that's what ethical monotheism is all about. Now, once you understand that, you can understand why God is so upset with Israel and why God is so upset with America today. In his eyes, what the Israelites were doing was just as evil, if not more, than the human atrocities these pagan nations were committing. And the reason I say if not more is because they had something the pagan nations didn't have. They had God's revelation. They had the Word of God. God had revealed to them through his word how they should treat others. And he had told them, if you don't treat others the way I tell you to treat others, you don't really love me and you can't really worship me. Now, having said that, I want to look at each sin individually, starting in verse 6, because we read over this and we go, what's that mean? Well, it's really quite simple, and I'm going to make it simple for you. Notice what it says in verse 6. Amos chapter 2. Thus says the Lord, for 3 transgressions of Israel and for 4 I will not turn away its punishment, because they sell the righteous for silver and the poor for a pair of sandals. They sell the righteous for silver and the poor for a pair of sandals. Now, this first sin has to do with money lenders taking advantage of the poor. You see, the Torah prohibited a Jew from charging interest on a loan to another Jew. How many of you knew that? If you were a Jew, an Israelite, you could not give a loan to another Jew and charge interest. But you could to a foreigner. And here's what's kind of interesting. Let me go a little bit further. When we get to the medieval period in the church picks up on this, and they understand that the things that are written in the Old Testament, they're meant to be a lesson for us. And as a result of being a lesson for us, what we're supposed to do is we're supposed to apply it. So the church came in and they killed themselves economically. And they said, we can't charge interest. But the Jews can, because they're not brothers of ours. And so here's what the Jews did. The Jews knew because of the Torah that they couldn't charge interest to Jews, but they could to foreigners, which meant the Gentiles. So the Jews became the bankers. And that's why they always prospered. It didn't matter how much that you came in and you persecuted them, they would prosper. But let me just show you what this says, that the Torah prohibited a Jew from charging a loan or charging interest on a loan to other Jews. Look with me in Deuteronomy chapter 23, verses 19 and 20. Do not charge interest on the loans you make to a fellow Israelite, whether you loan money or food or anything else. You may charge interest to foreigners, but you may not charge interest to Israelites, so that the Lord your God may bless you in everything you do in the land that you are about to enter and occupy. Now, look at Exodus chapter 22, 25. It says the very same thing, a little bit different. If you lend money to one of my people among you who is needy, do not treat it like a business deal. Charge no interest. You can do it to the foreigners. You can do it to the Gentiles and the pagans, but you can't do it to your brothers and sisters. So, if you can't charge interest on a loan to a fellow Jew, what's the incentive to do so? Well, you should do it out of love and compassion. But that ties up your money. And it keeps you from making money. Instead of making money with your money, you're letting someone else make money with your money because you're not even getting interest. So to get around this, the Jews would make the borrower put something up as collateral. And if they didn't pay, they would foreclose and take their collateral. Now, there's nothing wrong with wanting collateral for a loan. In fact, God didn't tell the Jews they couldn't do it. In fact, that's what he encouraged. If you're going to give someone a loan, you need to understand they probably are poor because they don't follow good business principles. So if you give them a loan, they're probably not going to be able to pay you back. How many of you learned that lesson the hard way? Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. So God didn't tell them they couldn't, make them put up collateral. They don't pay you back, then you get this and it's worth just as much. So there's nothing wrong with wanting collateral for a loan. But what they were doing at this time that Amos was getting onto them for was they were setting up loans that had a high probability of failure. So they could foreclose on the property and actually make money on it. If they lost, they made money. If they didn't lose, they didn't make anything. They didn't lose anything, but they didn't make anything. And they made sure that the collateral was worth more than the loan. But not only that, they would foreclose on the property if the borrower failed to live up to the contract in any way. If that person was $1 short or a day late, they foreclosed. And not only did they get to keep the collateral, but also any payment that had been made up into that time until the forfeiture. So they paid everything on time, but they were a day late. You not only got to keep that money, but you got to go and collect the collateral. And they were doing this purposely. Now, if they were short, even the price of sandals, which was cheap, too bad, too sad. That's business. And people, this is what Amos was talking about. Look at verse number 6 again. Thus says the Lord, for 3 transgressions of Israel, for 4, I will not turn away its punishment, because they sell the righteous. In other words, these people are honest, hardworking people. This doesn't mean righteous in the sense that they don't sin. This word righteous in the Hebrew means honest, hardworking people. He says, because they sell the honest, hardworking people for silver and the poor for a pair of sandals. Now, if all of the collateral wasn't there, then they had to sell themselves into slavery so that they could pay their debt. So the lender got the collateral, and he got the money for them being sold into debt. And if they were short, even the price of sandals. Too bad, so sad. Business is business. And they would try and set these contracts up so that they would fail. Their intent was not to help them. Their intent was to take advantage of them. Now let me tell you, we have that in America today. You want these short loans? Let me tell you, they ought to be outlawed. They take advantage of the poor. Someone needs new tires, can't go to work. They borrow $300 and you pay 24% interest. They never get out of debt. And by the time they pay that off, they need another $300. And all those little cards that come at Christmas time, let me tell you, that's an abomination to God, because that's what these people were doing. And let me tell you, what's wrong with the church today is that we don't stand up and say that this type of work is wrong, it's unethical. I've said this, and I'll always say this. All work is honorable as long as what? As long as it's not illegal or immoral. And there's a lot of things that are immoral. And there are people that are making lots of money off of the poor because they catch them in that place and they squeeze them and they know they're probably not going to make it, but I can get their car. Sign this place here. You can't pay off this $300. I get your car. And I get the $250 that you were paying on that plus the interest, and now you can't make it. So sad, too bad. The car is mine plus the $250. And these people are members of these golf courses and golf clubs, but they're doing it off the poor. Sorry. It bothers me. So that was the first sin they were guilty of. They were lending money to the poor with the sole intent of taking possession of their mortgage property through foreclosure. If you wanted to write them down as we go through, that's it individually. That's the very first sin that Amos says you're guilty of. Is America guilty of that? Do the rich take advantage of the poor? Do they look to see where they can put all these little fine lines in here? What was Wells Fargo just convicted of? Anyone know? If you had $60 in your account and you overcharge in your account, then they're going to have a finance fee of maybe $15 on it. So what would happen is if you had $60 in your account and you did something for $15, you go, okay, I have enough in there. They would wait and they wouldn't charge it yet. And then a day later you come in and you do something for $60. Well, now that's $75. You've overdrawn. So they would do the last one first to make sure you're overdrawn so they can do twice. And thank God, they come in and say, you can't do that. But that's accepted business practice. These type of things are happening all the time in America. It's what we do. I want you to understand something. Every sin of the 7 sins that I listed, America is guilty of. We're getting to this point. Now, where America is, and this is what we don't understand, things are going to get bad before the rapture occurs. Things are going to get bad, but how bad it gets for America depends on America. I never thought I'd see the day where we have 2 worthless candidates for president. And let me say this, one is worthless, but the other is evil. And if a Christian can vote for another person who condones the murder of the innocent and will not speak for the voiceless, and that's what abortion is, someone who will come in and say that same-sex marriage is right, yeah, I feel like doing like Jesus and making a little whip and driving people out. And to actually say that we need to change our religious beliefs. Let me tell you, persecution is coming. But I'll tell you what's worse. I don't mind the persecution. That's just a part of it. Jesus said we would have it. What scares me is the judgment of God. Because let me tell you something, people. You might think persecution's bad, and it's not. What's bad is when the judgment of God comes on our nation. And we're in a pivotal point here. I never thought we would get to this point, but here's the bad thing about momentum. Once momentum comes, it takes an act of God to push it back and go the other way. And we have reached that place. It's amazing to me that people get upset when you say all lives matter. It's amazing to me when you think that if you date someone for 3 times, it's okay to sleep with them. It's amazing to me to say that if you love someone enough to say, you know what, I love you, but I'm going to tell you what the Bible says, those who do these things will not enter the kingdom of heaven. We're hate mongers. No, the hate mongers are the ones that pat them on the back and say it's okay, and God loves you, and when they die, they're in hell and they wonder who didn't tell them. That's not love. Let me tell you, the greatest love I can have for you is to look at you right in the eye and tell you, if you don't treat others the way that God tells you to treat them, you don't love God. If you don't follow His moral principles, if you don't follow His values, you don't love God. Just read 1 John. And I say all this because the church has failed in praying for its nation. I doubt very seriously that more than 10% of you pray every day fervently with tears in your eyes that God would change America. And you don't know what's going to happen to your children. It's a done deal. It's going to happen. Canada, their prime minister is going to legalize marijuana in the spring, recreational marijuana. We already have the other states that are voting on it this coming next Tuesday. I can guarantee you within 4 or 5 years, more than half the states will legalize recreational marijuana. And this is what this is what our kids are going to grow up in. And you don't think that God's not going to judge us? As we go through these 7 sins, there's a reason I chose the book of Amos, because we are at a critical tipping point. And unless the church wakes up and the church understands ethical monotheism, if I don't follow the Word of God, if I'm more loyal to a political party, if I'm more loyal to my job, if you're more loyal to your union than you are to the principles of God, you don't love God. You're a liar is what John says. And people, we're already at a critical time. We're already at the point, we're the generation. I still believe we have 15 to 20 more years, but what's going to happen in this next 15 or 20 years is up to us as Christians. And we need to understand that.